Last lecture discussed the differences between human language and the communication systems of other animals, and we saw that important differences between them lie in the issues of displacement and productivity. Right? Displacement has to do with the fact that with human language we can communicate about things that are not immediately present, and productivity refers to the fact that human language, unlike the communication systems of other animals, it involves a system of rules for combining symbols together to create novel expressions. And that accounts for some of the power that language as a representational system has. In this lecture, we're going to discuss whether non-human animals can be taught human-like language. And this is going to be in two parts. And in the first part, we're going to introduce earlier attempts to teach primates a human-like language. So the question is, can animals learn a human-like language? And the 20th century saw many attempts to teach non-human animals language. And this research was motivated by different things. One of the motivations for this project was to examine whether language is an ability that makes use of specialized mechanisms that only humans possess. And this is the argument that was given by the great psycholinguist Noam Chomsky. Right? Chomsky argued that humans have a language acquisition device, a specialized module that allows children to easily acquire the language that's spoken around them. Right? Children have a language acquisition device that allows them to learn the rules of syntax. And it's made up of what he called universal grammar, which is a set of rules that all languages, all syntaxes have to abide by. And he said that humans have this and no other animal does. And that accounts for this difference. So the issue then is that there supposedly is a discontinuity between humans and animals in terms of this mechanism and in terms of the ability to acquire syntax. So the idea that humans have a special module for learning language would be refuted, at least to some extent, if you could show that animals could be taught syntax. Right? If you can teach animals syntax, it suggests that humans may not require a specialized mechanism in order to learn it. And the second argument, or the second reason for why people try to teach animals human-like language, was because it would increase our ability to communicate with them. Right? So think about that. If you're trying to do animal psychology, right, one of the challenges is that you really, have a hard time communicating with animals to figure out what's going on inside their heads. If you could teach them language, presumably it would be easier to understand what it is that they're thinking as they're doing something. Right? So understanding how their minds work would be greatly facilitated. The problem with that argument is that, or the warning that comes along with that, right? The caveat is that if you teach language to an animal, you may actually change the way their mind works. Right? So adding language to the mix may make their cognitive systems work in a very different way than it does naturally. So we saw something like that when we talked about teaching chimpanzees symbols for same and different, and we said that by teaching them these concrete symbols for sameness and difference, you make it easier for chimps to do certain things that they otherwise would have a much harder time doing, including relational mapping and reasoning by analogy. Okay, so we have to be careful. You may change the nature of animal minds by teaching them language. So let's look at some of the early attempts at teaching language to non-human animals. One of the earliest attempts is by Furness from 1916, who tried to teach an orangutan to speak English. And she was only able to learn 4 words. Right? And a similar lack of success has been found with chimpanzees. Hayes and Hayes in 1952 tried to teach a chimp named Vicky but all she was able to do was learn 4 words as well. Papa, mama, cup, and up. Right, that was the extent of her ability to learn how to speak. Now, why such a failure? Why is it so hard to train non-human animals to speak? And the difference has to do with the difference between humans and other primates has to do with the structure of the mouth and the throat. Right? These are represented in this figure. On the left, we have the mouth and throat structures of the human. On the right, we have the primate, and we can see that they're structured in very different ways. The upshot is that chimp mouths and throats are shaped very differently, and because of those differences in shape, it is impossible for them to form certain sounds. Right? They simply cannot put things in the right place in order to make certain sounds. So, because this was eventually realized, it led to a different attempt to teach animals human-like language. Right? In particular, it led towards a shift to teaching primates American Sign Language, right? ASL. ASL uses individual hand gestures to represent each word, and it also has a syntax that can be used to create sentences. Right? So it's a full-blown language. And one of the first attempts to do this, to teach a chimpanzee sign language, was the Gardners, Howard and Beatrice Gardner, teaching a chimpanzee named Washoe. And they started when she was age 1. And after 4 years, she was able to sign up to 132 different words. Okay, so quite impressive. Now, they tried to simulate as closely as possible how children actually learn language. And in doing so, they use what's called the cross-fostering method. Right? So in cross-fostering method, you teach language in the context of carrying out certain activities. Right? So they try to call attention as they're interacting with Washoe. They try to call attention to everyday events and objects that might interest the chimpanzee. So for example, they might say, if there's a ball nearby, look at the ball. Do you want to play with the ball? And things like that. So it also involves asking lots of questions to check on comprehension, and they always try to answer questions that Washoe has, and also to comply with Washoe's requests. So this would allow Washoe to test that she has a correct understanding of the symbols. And they also, as part of this cross-fostering method, they also use frequent repetition, right, repeating things again and again, just like we do with young children when we're trying to teach them language. So this was effective to some extent. Washoe was able to combine up to 5 signs together, and she would also use these to make requests and to answer questions. And she even displayed some instances of creativity in her sign use. So for example, a trainer once pointed to a swan and asked Washoe what it was, and she signed waterbird. Right, so a new combination of signs. And we will examine later in this lecture whether Washoe's and other chimps' productions are actually sentences and whether or not they can master syntax. But before we address that issue, I want to discuss some more examples of language-trained chimps. In particular, I want to talk about Lulis, another chimpanzee. Lulis was introduced to Washoe at 10 months of age, and she basically became a surrogate mother. Right? She took care of him after her own infant died. And Lulis was not taught sign language by humans, but he did learn it, and he learned it by copying Washoe. Right? So he would try to imitate Washoe, and she would also mold his hands in order to create different signs. So she taught him by molding his hands into different positions to make different signs. And according to Fouts, Lulis began to sign very quickly, right? About 7 days he started signing. At 15 months, he actually started to combine signs together. At 6 years, his vocabulary included 51 signs. And Fouts also tracked the development of his ability to produce phrases. Right? And a phrase is any utterance that consists of two or more different signs. So you chase and chase me would count as two different phrases, right? Because they involve two different words. So we can see that the number of 2-sign and 3-sign phrases increased over time. You can see this clearly in the top, which shows the number of 2-sign phrases that increased from 1979. Well, it took a slight dip in 80 and 81, but then increased to 84. The number of 3-word phrases, or 3-sign phrases, we can see kind of plateaued in 1982. But in general, they both increased over time. Fouts and his colleagues also studied how Lulis and his fellow chimps used the signs in their interactions with each other. So when they're just interacting with each other and not with humans, how do they use their signs? Right, so they set up cameras to record their interactions without any humans present. And they found that chimps often signed emphatically, right, feverishly during high arousal interactions, such as during fights and during active play. So for example, one time Lulis got into a fight with Washo, and Washo signed to him, come hug, and Lulis signed no, and then continued to move away and didn't want to have anything to do with her. So signing among these chimpanzees is a regular part of their interactions, and they also sign to themselves, right? Much like humans talk to themselves, right, while they're doing different things. So for example, they said that Lulis would sign to himself as he was looking at a magazine, right? So he would name the pictures that he's looking at all to himself. And in other cases, he would sign the name of a person who wasn't there. And what that shows is, some evidence of displacement. Now, another famous primate that's been taught language is Coco the gorilla. Some of you may be familiar with her. She was taught sign language, but she was also spoken to as well, so it came from multiple media. And she learned about 300 different signs. And she also appeared to use the signs creatively to refer to new objects. So for example, she signed bottle match to refer to a cigarette lighter, and white tiger to refer to a zebra. And her use of signs also shows that she was capable of displacement, because she would sign about things that are not present. So how do we know that? Well, she had a friend named Michael, right? Michael, she actually went through a whole process of picking mates, and she chose Michael, and he was brought in to mate with her. And when Michael wasn't around, she would sign about him. Okay, so that's displacement. And she also continued, they gave her a pet cat, and she would continue to sign his name long after he was dead. Okay, so displacement seems to be a reality for animals taught symbols. And I encourage you to watch this video. This is Coco interacting and signing with Robin Williams. It's a lot of fun. And so just copy and paste the link and check it out on YouTube. It shows you how she uses her signs in interacting with people. Sorry, that should say the problem of syntax. So why do some researchers deny the claim that animals can be taught human-like language? Right, so some researchers argue that no non-human animal can learn syntax. Syntax, as I've said, is the rules for combining symbols to create well-structured sentences. Right? There is a structure to language. Language isn't just a bunch of random words or words randomly stuck together. Right? There's rules for putting words together to create sentences. And in human language, for example, word order is very important. It's an important aspect of syntax. The order in which you put words together in a sentence indicates the role that they play, and that affects the way that a sentence is understood. So for example, man bites dog versus dog bites man. Those are exactly the same words, but they're put together in a different order, and the order affects the meaning. Right? In one case, in one version, man it might be the subject and dog the object, and in the other is the reverse, and that affects the interpretation. Right? As is often said, the first one is news, and the other not so much. So it's important not to underestimate the importance of syntax, right? Syntax allows us to create sentences with complex structure, right? We can say things like, the man next door who was bitten by the dog last week died suddenly from his injuries, right? There's rules that allow you to put these words together in this way to produce a well-formed formula in English and to have it make sense. And it's also syntax that tells us how to convert statements into questions, right? There's rules for doing this, right? Sally can lift Natasha is a statement, and you can convert it to a question. Can Sally lift Natasha? And there's complex syntactic rules that capture how to convert a statement to a question. And the argument goes that animals can't be taught rules of syntax. Right? The failure of animals to learn syntax is evident in the lack of regularity or structure to their signs. They really combine signs together arbitrarily. So one of these is Nim Chimpsky, another chimpanzee. He was named, I guess, in honor of the great linguist Noam Chomsky. Well, maybe it's not such an honor. But Herbert Terrace tried to teach language, including syntax, to Nim. All right, so sign language. And he tried to get Nim to produce signs in the right order to convey particular meanings. Right? And Nim was able to learn about 125 signs, and he even combined them in various ways. Right? And the researchers also kept immaculate records of all of his productions. And it included upwards of 19,000 statements. Right, so most of his combinations were 2 or 3 sign phrases, and when they went beyond that, as we'll see, they were largely repetitive. Right, so here's some examples of his 3 sign utterances. Apple, me eat. Banana, Nim eat. Banana, me eat. Drink, me Nim. Eat, Nim eat. Tickle me eat, yogurt, Nim eat. Some examples of his 4 sign quotations. Banana Nim, banana eat me Nim, banana me Nim me, banana me eat banana. You can read the rest on your own. The longest phrase that he gives, that's been recorded, is give orange me eat, give orange me eat, orange give me eat, orange give me you. Think about that. Is this really a sentence? From his study of Nim Chimpsky, Terrace concludes that Nim doesn't show an appreciation of syntax. Right? The 16 sign expression just seems like a repetitive jumble of signs with little attention paid to order and structure. Right? That's not language, and that's not a sentence. Right? So based on his study, Terrace concluded that animals don't have the ability to learn language, at least its syntactic component. Right? That structure of rules, that system of rules for combining symbols together, which is at the heart of language. Terrace et al. Also point out that chimps in these studies seem to use language in a way that's very different from the way that humans, even young children, use language. Right? In other words, chimpanzees don't engage in lengthy conversations with their trainers or with each other. Right? They simply use symbols to request things from others and in response to requests. Right? So if you look at this cynically, right, it looks like all they've done is learned what they need to do in order to get a reward from their trainers. And that's not the way that language in humans typically works or is used. And they also seem to copy their trainers a lot and to imitate previous expressions of others instead of using symbols creatively. Right? There's a relatively few documented cases of novel use of symbols, and I've mentioned some of those. But on the whole, their utterances are very repetitive, and they're very similar to ones that have been used by their trainers. Right? With human language, novelty of expression is not an exceptional case, right? As it is with language-trained chimps. Novelty is almost the rule. We're constantly saying new things by combining words together. Alright, so we've discussed attempts to teach primates human-like language, and though language-trained primates can show displacement, the ability to talk about things that are not immediately present, they seem to stumble when it comes to syntax and the productive aspects of language. Right, so this supports Chomsky's argument that humans have a special knack for language, in particular a special knack for syntax, which they master early on because they have a specialized mechanism for learning syntax.